Hello! It's lovely to have you all here. I guess I don't have to stand on my toes. If you don't know me, my name's Nancy Page, and I'm on the staff team here. But you didn't come here to hear me talk about AI, because I just know how to get ChatGPT to make me a schedule for the day. We are here to hear from Lyndon Drake. Lyndon, as Glenn said, he has a PhD from York in artificial intelligence, a PhD in Old Testament from Oxford. He's got one wife, 3 kids, and before he was here in Oxford, these are the stats he gave me, guys. Yeah. Exactly.
I was very eager not to confuse
yeah.
them. Yeah.
Before this, he was the archdeacon in the Maui Diocese of New Zealand. Is that right?
Absolutely.
It's close enough. All right. Over to you.
Thanks so much. This is the safe time to applaud because, if you don't like it, then you don't have to afterwards. It's like when you say thank you for a meal before you've tasted it. We'll see at the end whether you feel the same way. I'm so grateful to be here. I'm now going to try and make the screen appear, which is always one of those moments where you wonder if it'll spring into life. I'm sure somebody will be able to make that happen. It's a real joy to be back. My family and I went to St Ebbe's Headington for 2 years, and then we were here at this church for a year in 2017-18. And I appreciate both the friendship of the church and in particular Vaughan's kindness over the years, which has been a great encouragement to me. If you are aware, the church in New Zealand is possibly even more complicated than the church in England. And so having this connection back here has been a great encouragement to me in ministry there. And so I'm very, very happy to be with you tonight. Do you mind if I pray to begin, and then we can kick into things? Almighty Father, we thank you that you are the giver of all good gifts. We thank you most of all for the gift of your Son, our Saviour Jesus Christ, the wisdom of God. Father, we pray that by your Holy Spirit you would give wisdom to us in a changing world, and that you would give us confidence in your unchanging nature, your unchanging love for the world, and your unchanging desire to see people brought to a knowledge of salvation through Jesus Christ. I pray that you would inspire us afresh to give ourselves to serving you and to serving the gospel as we think about this topic that seems in some ways so disconnected from that. We ask this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. So we are confronted at the moment with a rapidly changing world. Any of you who are involved in the university will have encountered the rapid change in the way that some of the students are interacting with being asked to write tutorial essays. Some of you will have sympathy with a tutor who told me that he was able to detect when people had written their tutorial essay using ChatGPT, and he was a bit upset when I told him that that was the people who perhaps didn't know how to use ChatGPT very well, and that I was afraid that probably most of his students were writing with ChatGPT or some equivalent. This change is of a significant kind because it cuts through so many different aspects of life, and it's bringing change to areas of life that other aspects of societal change have not intersected with. And we hear a lot of conversation around jobs. There have been many changes in society that have affected jobs. I feel that perhaps this change is so newsworthy because it's intersecting with the jobs of journalists. And this gives a certain specificity to the idea that society is changing. Many of us here have some connection with thought leadership, with the professional world, with academia, and we're very conscious of the ways this is intersecting with us. But it's also true that this intersection is far broader than just that section of society. So this evening, that was an excellent meal. Because I'm standing up, I'm very unlikely to fall asleep. But if some of you do nod off, I just want you to hang on to a few things from the start of the talk that I'll come back to. I really want to emphasize that AI is not going to bring salvation for the human race. If you saw the video, by the way, I just finished doing a church service when I recorded it, so you won't be surprised to find, well, actually, maybe in the current climate, you will be surprised to find an Anglican minister saying that salvation is not to be found outside of Jesus Christ. AI is not the saviour of the world, okay? So we want to hang on to that, but I do want us to think about how this is expressed and why AI is not the saviour of the world. But I also want you to recognise that AI is not going to bring about the end of the world. This is not Judgment Day in some form, to use that Terminator language. I think AI is going to change you, and I think it's important to think about this as Christians especially, that one of the things we ought to be most attentive to is the way that technological and social change affects us as human beings and us as Christians, and the ways that it forms us, more so than I think some of these big picture worries about, are computers intelligent? Will they bring the end of the world? And so on and so forth. I think those questions are interesting and important, but they're not as important as this question of how will AI change me? Or I was very happy to see technology mentioned. I think we will find over the next few years that AI drops out of the picture a little bit in terms of public discourse, but technology is already changing us and will continue to change us. And I want to suggest to you that this is true partly because technology and AI are already changing you. I want to have a think about that together. So I want to do this by having a little think about certain aspects of AI. I'm actually not going to talk about that second point. I want to give lots of time for questions, and then I want to think a little bit together around theology and how this can contribute to thinking well about AI. I want to begin, though, by mentioning a series of novels by a person called Iain M. Banks. When he wrote his Iain M. Banks, he was writing sci-fi, very, very futuristic sci-fi novels. He also wrote other ones just as Iain Banks. I don't know how many people here have read some of these culture novels? One person. They're brilliant novels. I'm a big fan of trashy sci-fi and fantasy as a sort of mode of relaxing, which I ought not to be proud of. But the culture novels they're good novels as well as being futuristic. One of the reasons I mention them is they have been incredibly informative of the way that technical elites think. So every single one of SpaceX's rockets, landers, and so forth is named after a spaceship character in one of the culture novels. The culture novels portray a future in which superintelligent minds, they're called, far, far more intelligent than human beings, provide a benevolent oversight for a particular form of human society known as the culture that is expanded beyond its origin planet across galaxies, in which people are free to live lives unconstrained by material limitations. They have effectively unlimited resources at their individual disposal. They can live whichever life they could possibly choose to. And in the novels, they live these lives in ways that are characterized by a completely free expression of their sexuality in particular and their ability to shift across genders and live out a life of technical heaven. It's a picture of salvation. And these novels and others like them, but particularly these ones, I think have been extremely influential in the kind of language that those involved in creating the companies and structures in which much of the AI progress has taken place. A lot of the language comes from this futuristic vision of salvation and deeply informs some of the ambitions within those firms. So I think that you see this most clearly in SpaceX, with certain variations more recently, but there's an underlying cultural narrative that's brought into there. And this is why the language of salvation and also the language of judgment and of the end of humanity is so significant in public discourse around AI. Now, I think that's worth attending to, but I also think that it can be a distraction from something which I think is far more important, because it means that we give our attention to a future that I think is very different from the one that we've been told will happen. We already know how the story will end. The end of that story has been written, and it can distract us when we're given an alternate ending. And it can distract us from those things that we ought to attend to now. So I want to give you a little bit of a picture here of some of the technical aspects of AI. There are people here who are more expert than I in this, but I also want to just go over this to give you a sense of the breadth of what AI constitutes, so that we don't get caught up in a particular vision of progress. So I want to talk, first of all, about large language models and generative AI. When people talk about AI, this is largely what they mean. Generative AI are these AI tools and techniques that produce outputs that look similar to the creativity of human beings. They produce images that look like paintings that we could produce. They produce videos that look like a film director has had some craft and creativity. And most of all, large language models produce texts that seem very similar to the kind of texts that humans, very well-informed humans, could produce. Hence our issue with tutorial essays and why education is about to profoundly change. Large language models and generative AI, though, are only one part of the broader field of AI. So I started my AI PhD in the year 2000. People are sometimes surprised about that. They say, oh, well, did AI even begin then? Well, it began in the 1960s. In fact, there have been several generations of this idea that AI is going to fundamentally change the world and bring about technological salvation. It's always led to some sort of disappointment. There's a truism within the field of AI that says that once AI scientists have figured out how to solve a problem, it's no longer considered to be AI anymore. And I'm going to come back to this. All of you here use AI constantly, every day. You just don't think about it as being AI. Now, generative AI, though, is something where there's been an enormous application of something called deep learning, and artificial neural networks, which are used in deep learning models mostly, have little to do with how human brains actually function. There's a sort of conceptual similarity, but fundamentally, the way that they work and do computation is radically different, fundamentally different from the way that we know that human brains function. And this is where the term intelligence is, I think, deeply confusing to the conversation, because it makes us think that these systems which are producing something which looks like human artifacts has anything to do with the way that humans arrive at the production of human artifacts. AI is really about trying to do the things that humans are good at. The way that the systems work is fundamentally different in its conception and technical details. And therefore, a lot of the conversation, which talks about things like reasoning, that talks about intelligence, and that talks about creativity, distracts us from how they actually work. We don't actually understand how many of these things really work. And even more than that, we don't have a great idea yet about exactly how human brains function. There are enormous gaps in our knowledge there. So when we try to draw comparisons, these comparisons are often misleading and always partial and inexact. Deep neural networks are amazingly useful, though. They do some very, very cool things. I won't go into the details of what that's about, but for example, those of you who have some connection with medical imaging will have seen that neural networks for medical imaging produce some amazing results. I went to a presentation recently at Oxford where a stroke analysis, a CT analysis tool for stroke diagnosis increased the number of patients arriving at a particular hospital with a certain set of symptoms who returned to normal life from 18% to 48%, simply from using this tool. We ought to celebrate that. That's a wonderful thing to see come into our medical system. And there are particular things here that work very well. Generative AI takes neural networks and uses them to produce some other things, though, rather than just to analyze. And here I wanted to show you, I can't remember if this is the video. I'll come to the video in a moment if this isn't it. I want to show you some of the limitations here. So I've asked a video generation tool to produce a video of me cycling along a canal towpath and to show the changing seasons as I go along. And I took some photos over the course of several months to try and illustrate that. And I want to show you what the video that's produced from this actually looks like. Let's see if this plays. So you can see there's somebody biking along. Oh, where did that other cyclist pop up from? And can you see as well that even though I gave it detailed instructions that the seasons needed to change, they didn't in fact change. So have a look here again. There's another magical cyclist appears. So all of these generative AI tools are trained to produce things that are plausible. There's no model of the world built in inside of them, or at least if there is, it's partial. So this is a contested technical point. And you can carry on and try and prompt it more and more and more, but some of these flaws, so this is another video. Did you see the video there? It just shows me a bunch of pictures, the same pictures I gave it as inputs. And here's a third one. A little bike turn, so it's the same one, sorry. So it goes through the pictures, and then a random bicycle turns up right at the very end. So if you're a film director, this ought to give you some consolation that perhaps you still have some utility. I use generative AI tools dozens of times every single day. Anyone who tells you that they're about to take over the world needs to spend some more time actually using them. They're incredibly useful, but they're also extremely brittle in ways that, in my view, are tied to the way that they work technically. I don't see that being overcome. So just on a technical point of view, rather than a theological point of view, I don't want you to be too worried at this stage that the world is going to end because this particular system is going to wake up and decide that humans are no longer essential to the running of the world. I use them a lot of the time to write computer software code. They frequently produce code that doesn't even compile, much less run. And if it does run, it often does the wrong thing. So even if one of them were to conceive of this idea, they would then produce a bit of software that didn't work. If that makes sense. So just hold those two things in tension. They are incredibly useful, and they're incredibly fragile in ways that I think are deeply bound to the way they work. Oh yes, I've said all of that already. Here are some more examples. I'll just show you one example here. Because I'm a maths geek, I gave it this problem. I think Vaughan knows Andy Satch, who pitched this one, I think, on my Facebook page. Don't worry too much about it. You'll have heard a lot of people as well talking about the fact that reasoning models are able to solve complex problems. This is a relatively straightforward mathematical problem, if you like maths. I really like maths. And a reasoning model was unable to solve this. I'm very proud of the fact that I used far more than my subscription fee in computation time for OpenAI by repeatedly asking it to solve this problem. It would typically spend about 15 minutes of computation time before returning a wrong result. After a while, I thought, I wonder if this really does know what it's trying to solve. So I asked it to redraw the picture, and it redrew it like that. So this is, at the time, ChatGPT's top-level model, top-level access to the model, and it can't get even a basic thing like, see this mathematical diagram and redraw it for me, and it's completely and totally wrong. So there's a brittleness and a fragility there. But having said this, there are some extraordinary AI successes. One of them you use all the time. Search is a technical computer science problem that used to be hard to do. Every time you use satellite navigation on your phone, there is a complicated search algorithm running which finds a path for you. And most of the time this works really well. I very much doubt any of you think that you're using AI at the point that you use that. I've mentioned medical imaging, and then the one I want to mention here as well is social media. So the average adult in the UK in their 20s apparently interacts with social media for more than 2 hours per day. Social media runs on a class of AI algorithms which is sometimes called recommender algorithms. These have a couple of components to them. One of them is an embedding algorithm, which condenses everything that's known about you by that company down to a small vector. And it needs to be able to do that in a very tiny fraction of a second, so it can decide what to show you next. And it chooses what to show you next, largely on the basis of what will keep your attention and keep you scrolling. Now, I just want you to think about that for a moment. First of all, in terms of the time. So I think most church ministers would love the idea that we were having a formative influence on people for about 2 hours a day or more. Reality is that I'm pretty sure I've never had that much formative influence on people. I've certainly never had that much time with anyone. So just think about that time component that we are giving to an algorithm. And then think from a Christian point of view around the relationship between our desires, especially our instinctive desires, and what we would desire to be when we're able to reflect on who we are. Now, these algorithms are designed to react to your most instinctive desires and to feed you more content. So I gave a talk recently, and a gentleman stood up and he said, I found that on Instagram, I'm constantly shown what is effectively soft porn videos. And he said, I've never asked for them, and I don't know how to get rid of them. Now, the fact is, the reason he gets them is because he's paused in his scrolling briefly enough, because his attention's been captured by something, and over time, the algorithm has recognized, not in any sort of conceptual way, that it will hold his attention for longer by feeding his desire. Now, for many of us as Christians, we recognize that our instinctive desires are to be mortified, if I can use that old-fashioned language, not fed. Our primary engagement with AI at the moment, for most of us, certainly for all of us who use social media, is with something that I think is theologically deeply problematic, because it's designed to feed our desires rather than to amend our desires. And this is why I want to say that one of the key things we ought to think about here is how are AI tools and techniques changing and forming us as Christians and those who are outside the church. And I'm just going to say a little bit here around theology, and then perhaps by about past I'll open it up for questions. There is an opportunity here to engage theologically, and that's because AI is spreading rapidly in the majority world. In a way, it's similar to the way that mobile phones enabled a different form of banking in Africa, they leapfrogged sort of traditional banking setups. The deployment of AI tools can bring enormous good in majority world settings, and I think there will be a lot of appetite for it. An Indonesian researcher told me that she wants to bring AI-based GP care into areas of Indonesia because whilst it may well not be as good as having an actual human GP, it's better than having no GP. And so I think there's going to be a rapid expansion into the majority world. And the world in general has a majority of religious people, and that's especially true in the majority world. This gives us as the church an opportunity to engage in theological language and theological thinking about AI. As AI companies, perhaps not for the right reasons, recognize that to engage in that world, they also need to engage with a theological account of ethics. And theologians, any church minister, has been thinking about issues of what does it mean to be human, and what does human work look like, what's the value of human work in a changing world, and how can we respond to technological change? These are not new things for the church to confront. And therefore we can draw on the resources and the wisdom of the previous centuries in the church, because we do have confidence that whilst the world is changing, the message that we have to share about Jesus Christ and its implications for our daily life is unchanging. It needs contextualization, but it is in fact something that is worthwhile to offer to the world. So just having that confidence that as the church, we offer Christ, and that Christ is valuable to offer to people in this setting. There are a bunch of novel issues. So I would say in my encounters with those who work daily in the AI industry, I think the church is not well equipped to understand what they do day by day. And therefore, we ought to learn how to understand the work that AI engineers and scientists do so that we can engage with them well as the church. There's going to be immense social change that comes about, partly through jobs, but also through changes in education. But also major technological changes in the world often have very difficult to predict structural changes to society. And as the church, we need to be ready to be nimble in those spaces. So in the past, those have involved things like industrialization and the move to cities, which changed the structure of the parish setup. The printing press, I think, was interesting because the church was deeply involved in immediately using the printing press as a way of distributing Bibles and other Christian literature. So we're a bit behind the curve in terms of AI. And perhaps the church has not been a leader this time round, but we ought to have confidence that we can engage as the church in this space and do it well. So just a few constructive things then to finish up with. I think we ought to celebrate what is good. I don't think we ought to be what I call naive or romantic, so don't buy into the salvation language about AI. But I don't think we should be ignorant or reactionary either. So I think there's a risk here that as Christians, we notice the salvation, the eschatological language that gets used, and as a consequence, we want to critique that only. But I think a different mode is to celebrate what is good, to say that humans involved in work in the world are, in one sense, God's hands and feet, so that when we see people improving medical outcomes for stroke victims, we should be at the forefront of celebrating that, as well as being attentive to the modes in which that can be misused or might have problems. We should continue to offer Christ and have confidence about doing that. Theologians especially need to work well with practitioners. The cultural West, here in Oxford at least, we ought to be attentive to the majority world and the challenges which our sisters and brothers in the majority world, especially our Christian brothers and sisters, are encountering as companies roll out AI, but also draw on the majority world for hidden labour. So a lot of AI systems require hidden and dehumanising labour to produce the data that's then trained on, and we ought to be deeply attentive to the social cost and harm of that. I think we ought to have a real focus on the formative effects of AI tools on the human person. In education, a paper has come out quite recently which demonstrates quantitatively what most of us would have an instinct about, which is that if you use AI tools all the time, instead of thinking and working hard, it turns out you don't learn as much. So some people have argued, I've seen that Ohio State University have decided to cave in and say you can use AI for everything, including assessments and learning. They might as well give up on the idea of the university at that point. Now, I recognise the problems in the model. There's no way that you can do assessment anymore unless it's invigilated. It's probably difficult to do teaching unless it's in person. But I think that many structural and technical changes in society really alert us to trends that have already started and which, from a theological point of view, we could arguably have been attentive to. So the scaling up and depersonalization, the disembodying of education, is a trend that we could critique theologically. We could argue that it's important that as much as possible we're here and engaged with each other person to person, and we could recognize that this technical change brings that trend to a crisis point, but it's not the instigator of the trend, it simply accelerates it. I think we also need to be very attentive to the ways in which capital structures, so here I'm talking about money, financial allocation, and the other associated power structures are part of the picture. So not just dealing with this as individuals, but recognizing that there are systems and institutions being created here that we, especially as, so I'm very much a Protestant in my skepticism about the innate goodness of fallen human beings. And fallen human beings have a tendency to create structures which embed fallenness in them, and particularly when they're given power. Some of these companies now, even though they're incredibly innovative, and I want to celebrate their innovation, are also extremely powerful. And a right caution and skepticism about the ability of fallen humans to use power well and for good outcomes ought to inform our attentiveness to these things. I won't go through some of these slides here, and we've already talked about formation. And I just want to finish up with two very practical suggestions here. So I really encourage people to use generative AI tools. I want to really encourage you not to anthropomorphize them. So in other words, don't provide prompts that treat the system as if they were a human. So I've tried to really make this my practice. I instruct my computer to do things for me. I don't say, for example, please to it. I don't talk about you. There is no you. There's no ghost in the machine. I tell it to do things because it's effectively what I've been doing for decades, which is writing software. It's just in this case, the software looks like English. The reason I suggest that is that the more you anthropomorphize the machine, the harder it is for you to distinguish between the responses that come back and responses which are truly human. And in the end, these machines have been trained on all of the output of humanity. And I'm sorry to break it to you, but a lot of the output of humanity is deeply, deeply flawed. You'll have all seen the need for guardrails because it's very easy to make a large language model that is misogynist, racist, and generally hateful. In fact, unfortunately, that is to some degree the default mode of a large language model. It takes a lot of work to stop it from doing that. When you're interacting with the machine, that's what lies behind it. The more you anthropomorphize it, the more risk there is that you will receive its responses as if they come from an authoritative human person. And I don't want you to do that. And I also want you to be careful not to naively rely on its output. So I saw one computer scientist posted on what used to be Twitter and is now called X recently, and said, the more I know about a subject, the more the responses from ChatGPT are filled with errors. And I say errors, not hallucinations and not falsehoods. The machine doesn't tell lies, and it doesn't hallucinate. It can't. But it can produce errors. And I would say this is absolutely true. It's a great resource, and it's error-prone. And the more of a healthy skepticism you can retain around that, the less likely you'll start to treat it, and I use this word advisedly, as gospel. We do have a reliable source of information, but I'm afraid it's not ChatGPT. And nor is it Claude. None of them. They're all the same. So just returning to those initial points, not that one, this one. AI is not your savior. It's also not going to bring the end of the world. It is going to change you, and I think you ought to be very attentive to the ways that it already is changing you so that you can give more attention to the way that it's forming you. As a Christian, you ought to care very deeply about the ways that you're being formed. And I want to encourage you to seek out ways of managing that, of using AI tools well, while managing it so that you're not being inadvertently formed in ways that you would wish not to be in your better moments. Thanks so much for listening, and I'm really, really keen to have questions. I can see that Nancy has a microphone. I imagine if you're inspired to give a speech instead of a question, she can probably remove the microphone as well, which is focus attention.
I just wondered if you could expand a bit more on how education is going to change. Do you have any kind of insight on what some of the plans are in how that's going to change? Thank you.
So I think there's two broad fields. The really simple one is assessment. So assessment is often shifted to a coursework-based setup where you get to work on things by yourself without supervision that can tell whether you're asking an AI tool. I think that model now is fundamentally broken because it's really a test of how well you can use a chatbot. So if you're naive, it'll produce a response that is recognizably an AI response and will be filled with the kind of errors that AI responses often include, and you'll get caught. If you're good at using it, then you'll produce an outstanding piece of work. That takes more work than a naive engagement, but I can assure you it takes a lot less work than the kind of assessment where you had to do all the work yourself. So I think the models of assessment really have to change, because any kind of coursework assessment now that's not supervised by somebody who can see what you're doing is completely corrupted by the use of AI tools. If you can get students to talk honestly about that, you'll find that's pretty universal now. The more complex thing then, I think, is how do we learn? And I think this is really important to think about how we're formed as Christians as well. The bit where we struggle and fail, where we have to read for ourselves and try and produce integrative results from it, is actually very important to the process of learning. And I think that's true in terms of learning how to live well, how to live a godly life. Much to my disappointment, it turns out it's not a trivial process, and it requires time and God's great patience with me. And I think there's a model there with how teaching ought to function with people more generally. It's embodied, it involves struggle and failure, the care and patience of a teacher who's invested in the outcome of the person. And so I think that side of things really needs to be addressed well. And one of the challenges of these tools becoming so widely available so quickly is it criticalizes that problem without institutions having time to address them. So when I say that Ohio State University has caved in one sense I admire them. They've looked at the problem and they've recognized it's an enormous problem, and they might as well just go, we're not even going to play this game anymore. I gave a talk in the United States recently on AI, and there was the president of a seminary who told me, this was in a public setting, so I'm not betraying her confidence. She said that they've decided, in fact, they've already done this. They've asked a large language model to write their curriculum and all the scripts for their lectures, for all of their subjects. They've then video scanned the faculty, and they've had a video generation tool produce avatar videos of them reading the scripts. Now, she was excited about this because they've also then produced machine translations, which, as an aside, I would very much question the theological accuracy, but assume for the moment they can get that right, of these scripts. Now, to my mind, what's missing from that is that when we're training people for Christian ministry, I don't think we think this is merely a matter of hearing a computer-generated talk. We think there's more going on there, and I think the same is true of education more generally. It's certainly in how Christians have thought about education in the past has been different from that. And so my instinct is to say, absolutely there are some scalable things that we can do, but we actually ought to reverse the scaling in other ways and seek a more embodied form of education. I mean, this is a bit naive, it's not determinative, but if he had chosen, Jesus could have done a very high-scale version of training people for Christian ministry. And I think there's something in it that he chose the opposite of that. And whatever we do needs to have some account of why Jesus did that.
Oh, I was going to ask, what do you have to say, to people who say that our brains are no different really from generative AI, in that we are just statistical machines and we predict the next token, the next word, based on the input we see on our brain states?
I think that's a really great question. I think there'd be a couple of things to say. What we do know about how our brains work does not correspond closely with how large language models function. And so the ways in which our brains work to generate speech, I think we have enough evidence to say work quite differently from that. I do think there's an interesting question around materiality and the degree to which we're embodied creatures. I'm very nervous about theological accounts of how we think that are based on the absences in our scientific knowledge. So what I don't want to do is to tie ourselves down as Christians and say there's some disembodied part of me that does the real thinking that lies behind the brain's thinking. Partly because I genuinely don't think that's the case, but also because I think it's a very risky bet as the church to commit ourselves to that position where we don't know for sure one way or the other. So I don't have any problem with a material account of thinking that says that our brains think. And I see no conflict with that, between that and account of us as spiritual beings, if that makes some sense. I would want to simply tie it to the fact that large language models compute in ways that are radically different from the ways that we know. For the bits we know about how human brains function, we are confident that large language models function differently. Yeah.
Just going to inside churches, case study, a pastor says, I'm going to write my sermon using generative AI and deliver it verbatim. Clearly that's got problems with it. There's no sense in which AI can sense the spiritual component of the preaching is different to writing a book. So can you just comment a little bit about the sort of engagement in theological sense and sort of openness to the Holy Spirit in teaching and all those sorts of elements? I haven't framed it very well, but I'm just interested in that.
No, I think that's a perfectly good framing of it. Again, I'd want to locate this within a wider conversation of what we believe preaching to be and some of the trends that we've already seen in the church. So a dear friend of mine in New Zealand is very committed to a multi-campus model of preaching in which there's a local congregation and where he appears on various screens around the city as a disembodied presence. And there are some things that are good that come out of that. And I can see why he's done it. But as well as the preparation aspect, where absolutely, I would hope that all Christian preachers believe that a prayerful approach to preparation is essential and has real effects. We think there's something that's genuinely happening there. I do think there's also this point around the connection with an actual group of people whose spiritual care has been entrusted to you. Otherwise, the fact is that some people are actually better preachers than others. And why don't we all just tune into the best preacher at any given stage? Now, there's a contextual aspect to it, but there's also the fact that, I can be very blunt. I would much rather listen to Vaughan preach than many of the sermons that I've heard. But there's something very important about that connection of pastoral care for a group of people and the preaching of the word to them. And I think divine action is not merely located in preparation, divine action is located in the act of preaching. And simply at a sort of personal level, I've been frequently surprised that some of my objectively worst sermons, and I've delivered some real train wrecks over the years, in God's amazing kindness and in his desire to humble me, those have been some of the most fruitful ones. And it's absolutely crystal clear that it wasn't my brilliance in preaching that produced this, and it was God's extraordinary grace. And I think the moment we buy into a model where it's around quality in some objective sense or popular sense, I think we've lost that. And there's a lot of theological assumptions embedded in what I'm saying. I deeply believe in the multiplication of churches and of ministry. I think I want to see many, many ministers, and I have a deep commitment to the idea of the parish and of a community that a minister can know well as a sort of baseline model for things. So a lot of what I'm saying is predicated on a bunch of assumptions that some of my dear friends don't share in the same way, and So I just want to recognise that there's well-intentioned difference there. What I think is interesting, though, is most of them are a bit allergic to the idea of using generative AI to write a sermon, even if they can't quite account for why. And I think we should be attentive to that. When we have distaste as Christians, sometimes that's bad, and we're reacting badly to something that we ought to approve of. But I think it's a useful thing to attend to. And to think, well, is this the Spirit's work? is it because over time, the way I react I've been formed as a Christian, and even though I think one thing, I kind of know something else. And I think this is a good moment for the church to go, well, if you're uncomfortable with that, why are you not uncomfortable with these other things as well? I can pontificate about this for a long time, by the way, so I better stop there.
Can I ask about fake news, which seems to be quite a big problem, and AI seems to make it worse, generating fake videos and fake everything. How should we be responding to that? Is there anything we should be doing? I don't know what your comment is on it.
Yeah, I mean, fake news is hardly a new thing. Well, it makes certain modes of it easier. And I think, you can go back far enough and you can find, the USSR editing photos, and absolutely it makes it easier. So I can go on my phone and I can remove somebody I don't want from my photo in seconds rather than it being a skilled work. But again, I just want to emphasise it's accelerating something that's already there. And I also think it raises the question of how do we actually know what's true? So a lot of what gets reported in news has always, of course, embodied certain biases in terms of the selection of and how things are presented. And some of the rise in fake news arises because of a loss of trust in the institutions that present us with news. Some of that is ill-founded, but some of it is well-founded. Now, I profoundly reject Elon Musk's view that X is now a source of reliable, truthful news in contrast with what he calls legacy media. I mean, you don't have to spend long on it to find the amount of nonsense that's there too. But I do think he's reacting to a cultural loss of trust in other institutions that is partly deserved. And if we ever want to rebuild a sense of trust and a means of engaging with what's fake and what's true, we have to have some kind of shared social norm for what actually does constitute truth. Now, I think Christians are particularly well placed to help develop this because, and it's so common to have this idea that there's a secular world and then there's Christian beliefs. But let's recover a confidence that, not because we're clever, but because God's been very kind to us, that we are describing the reality of the world when we describe it in Christian terms. We're telling the true story of the world, including the true story of what's going to happen to it. And I think if we can recover that confidence, and I don't mean pride, I do mean this in a humble way, then we have a chance of rebuilding trust. But I don't think there's something technical here to attend to. I think it's something social. So, people shouldn't make technical tools that help you lie. It's a very bad idea. And I think, there's, just as an example, Apple have limited the photo editing AI tools that they build in. And they were asked about this, and they said, we believe that what we call a photograph ought to record something that really happened. I think that's a fascinating statement in this sort of postmodern world. In some ways, Apple's a very postmodern company, but they said it ought to record an event that really happened. I thought, wow, I can get on board with that. I believe in that. So they've limited the kinds of things you can do to edit the photo on purpose. And other companies have taken a very, very different route. So even in our purchasing choices, then we can engage in different ways around that. So, yeah.
So coming from a slightly different angle, as a Christian, should I be thinking about any of the resource implications of AI? They have massive data centers that are very, very power hungry, and clearly there is a societal cost of meeting that power demand, and also a societal cost and cost to vulnerable individuals of the climate impact of those emissions. So is there anything there that you would talk to?
It's a massively important point. And before, when I talked about engaging with the majority world, as with many of these things, it's people in the majority world who will suffer most greatly from the consequences of that. Including, by the way, in the production of the material objects. So there are a number of... There's a very good book by a guy called Ed Conway called Material World, which I really commend, which talks about the degree to which we think about technological progress as being virtual and disembodied, but it relies on large numbers of material resources that typically involve power imbalances and the mistreatment of the poor. I think the energy problem is more solvable than the, for example, rare earth metals problem, partly because I do think there are clean power solutions, though this depends on whether you consider nuclear power to be clean. So I do, but I recognise that many people don't. But there are ways of constructing new nuclear power and making that adjacent to efficient data centres. I think there are good arguments for thinking about the pace of change and of what constitutes progress is something which we ought to be able to narrate theologically. But I think an attention to that is something that I think is deeply important. So in my own work in the university, we've identified that as one of the main areas that we want to develop theological, ethical reasoning about. But we want to do that really with our majority world partners because we think they're most affected by this.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. I have a question about, I guess, life and sentience within AI. I guess, how do we define what life and sentience looks like? And I guess even though we know that the large language models don't necessarily have the same process as a human mind, is there a sense in which that, I guess, doesn't really matter that much, that there's still life there? I guess I'm just curious, how do you define life? And then I guess, how does that matter with how we interact with AI? I guess to not anthropomorphize them, but do we speak with them as things that could eventually have life and have sentience or something like that?
That's a great question, and that question comes up a lot. So if you take the N.M. Banks, the cultural world idea, then absolutely, once you achieve sentience, which is very poorly defined in computer science, in fact, I think most computer scientists are very reluctant to talk about it because it's very hard to know what it even means. But we have some sort of sensibility around sentience, don't we? And we tie that, I think, a lot of the time to an account of what being human and being alive means. I really want us to use this, though, as a chance to push back on that account of life. I think that this has come about really as a consequence of secularization, and it involves us really devaluing, I don't mean us here, but I mean as a society, it's part of the picture that involves us devaluing as having a lesser life, or perhaps no life at all, or a life not worth living, of those who are unable to think in the same way as many of us here are able to. And so any account of life that's tied to ability to think, I think, is very deficient theologically. So we might use the language, if we want to use the language of life, I think we want to tie it to this idea of God gifting life to humanity. So, at some point in the distant evolutionary past, there's a marker point there where God marks this as being life is now in existence. And if we accept that, and if we accept the language of Genesis around image bearing as the primary thing, I really want to recover that language of image bearing as the primary thing. At that point, it doesn't really matter if the computer gets better at certain things than me. I mean, the fact is the computer is already way better at certain kinds of maths than me. A calculator is better at certain kind of maths than me. I just think the whole question about which things it's better at than me has absolutely no relevance to how I treat the computer. It will always be an object, and how I treat other humans. And I think it gives us a real opportunity. I would say it's entirely plausible that, say in your lifetime, that computers are better at all tasks that humans might give themselves to. That is one possible outcome. It might not happen, I'm a bit skeptical about it, but it could happen. And at that point, we need an account of being human and of being alive that is utterly different. And I think Christianity offers us that. And it could then involve a redemption of the idea of useless lives, of disabled lives, of lives where people can't survive by themselves because they're in the womb or because they're dependent. And I think we could re-encourage this idea of dependency as a good. It's part of God's good gift to humanity that we're deeply, deeply dependent on each other, including, in some cases, utterly dependent for the basics of life. So I think it's more about how we describe ourselves than how we describe the machine, if that makes some sense.
We have time for maybe 2 more questions.
Haven't worded this question really well. So I guess I was just thinking about when you're talking about having an AI doctor in the majority world is better than having no doctor. And so what would you say, I guess, about people who don't feel like they have a sense of community and so they go to like AI to find that sense of community? And this is also in conjunction with like something else that I was thinking. So there is a therapist friend I know who uses AI as a tool for him and his employees to generate prompts and poems and things. And so like, for example, poems to comfort. He'll be like, can you use this passage and rewrite it for the modern day to bring comfort to someone who is wrestling with this? Or can you look at the concept of internal family systems in therapy and create a conversation between a theologian and a therapist and this? And so at what point is AI no longer just a tool that you would recommend using it for, given the assumption that we are careful with the parameters that we give it, and we're careful with the output that it gives back to us? So I guess it's like a kind of 2-pronged question.
Yeah, so I've got that second one. What was the first one again?
The first one was kind of like, what would you say to someone who, like you said, with AI, having an AI doctor is better than not having a doctor, yeah.
So on that first one, I think, the reason I mentioned that Indonesian researcher is because I think there are complex trade-offs. I mean, I can see Maria Ambrosio is sitting there. She's far more expert on this than me. And I think it's worth considering those trade-offs there. And I think if we can think about it in terms of trade-offs rather than absolutes, that's potentially quite a helpful way of addressing it. And as long as we remain very attentive to the idea that there are trade-offs. There's an issue around merely meeting our desires, again, so I talked about that before. So again, I've heard somebody say that she's lonely and AI can make her feel less lonely. That may be true, but there are at least 2 other Christian responses. One is that through suffering, God can teach us things. So I don't think we ought to seek suffering in the hopes that it means that we end up being taught, right? That's not the ideal. But at least a consideration of the possibility that a therapeutic mode is not the only mode of existing in the world. If there are other problems that come with it. So if, for example, if somebody were to say to me, I was lonely and I've come to church and I've found that this brings me community and I now feel like I belong to other people and I belong to God, that's a wonderful outcome. If somebody says to me, I found this machine and I'm no longer lonely, to me that's a less good outcome. Now it might be of some good, but it may also distract us from helping that person find a true good, to be part of the Christian family. And that's what I'm very cautious about with some of those things. And I think that feeds in then to my comment on your second question there. So as soon as we start using AI to produce things, the risk is that we start to de-skill ourselves about our own capacity to do so. Now, there's an efficiency argument. So I use AI tools to produce a lot of computer code. And for a moment, I'm more efficient. Maybe I'm losing something else. And again, because they're so new, I don't think we actually know much about this. And I think we ought to be very attentive to that. And I think there's also then a knock-on thing. If we de-skill ourselves as human experts, our ability to train other people to be human experts is potentially an enormous social loss. So there's a lot of work around this in medicine at the moment, and there's also a lot of work in defence. But maybe we need to think about it more broadly than that too. So the idea of de-skilling, and there is some work on using AI tools to do skill maintenance, to help articulate tacit knowledge, and to think about training as well. So those would strike me as being very constructive uses of AI, but they're not the big money maker. Yeah. And I'm fairly certain that we've hit 9 o'clock, so. Of course.
A quick question. You mentioned that many people see in AI either salvation or judgment or damnation, like the end of the world. And you mentioned how even though this may be overreacting, it's maybe because there are some elements of maybe that provide a picture. And I'd be interested, so we talked how AI can really deliver for some things, help. And what is exactly the link you were thinking of, if I understood you correctly, between AI and judgment?
Yes, so the point I was trying to make is that people use this language of salvation or of judgment, depending on their tendency. Sometimes people combine both together. So, if you listen to Elon Musk, it will be our salvation. If you listen to the AI doomers, they think that it's going to take over the world and decide to remove humanity from the picture. A bit like the ancient Near Eastern gods, humans are annoying and smelly and noisy. Let's make them go away, So those are the sort of two big picture narratives that I see being talked about over and over again. Now, my instinct on this is that we all, as human beings, are theologically inclined in certain ways to attend to reality. So there will be a day of judgment, and there will be a day of salvation. They're deeply related to each other. And it's not because humans are annoying, but because of a moral issue. So we have a different account of that, but it's unsurprising that people build narratives that correspond with this. And if you pick up Tom Holland's book, Dominion, as well, that in the cultural West, we're also deeply formed by the Christian narrative. So we reproduce heretical versions of Christianity. So this account of salvation or of damnation is a deformed and heretical, distant, and descendant of Christianity. So that's really what I was trying to get across, that these narratives have enormous social power, and we have to be very careful not to accidentally buy into either side of them or the assumptions that are built in as we talk about AI. So does that make that any clearer? And if not, then we'll need to talk later. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, Lyndon. It's been really great to have you. Let's give him a big round of applause. You're welcome to stick around. You don't have to leave. But we would love a bit of help just clearing the table. So if we all could clear our own table, that'd be lovely. Thank you.
Cool.